tonight we're going to be looking at the early history of Lake Minnetonka, kind of a big picture, early history of just the formation of the lake, etc. And then the rest of the program will be focusing on Wayzata. And what I've kind of planned for us is that we're going to take a little trip through the early history of the lake, talk about the glory years briefly, and then we're going to talk about Wayzata history up until about 1910. Had to kind of find a cutoff spot with regard to time and that kind of thing. So we're going to begin with the geological origins of Lake Minnetonka, beginning with the glaciers about 10,000 years ago. So this slide is depicting the lobes of the glacier as they're coming across Minnesota. You can see the right side is going to be the piece that's coming across Hennepin County, Lake Minnetonka area. And this slide is just showing the St. Croix moraine, and again you can see where that blue arrow is pointing. There's kind of a dotted black line crossing again Hennepin County, Lake Minnetonka area. So this is going to be leading to the formation of the topography of the land that we know today, as well as our lakes. And this slide depicts kind of the process of the formation of a kettle lake. And kettle lake is the type of lake that the geologists talk about as far as the Lake Minnetonka lake formation. And what happens is these large blocks of ice are sitting upon layers of sediment, and over the years when the glacier starts to melt and these depressions formed by the glacier sitting in the sediment then fill with the water as it melts, and any of the debris on top of the glacier adds in and kind of becomes part of the bottom, and that's called a kettle lake. And the interesting thing about Lake Minnetonka is that it's basically considered to be a series of kettle lakes. So if you think about the look of Lake Minnetonka as you know it and all the various bays, those were all individual kettle lakes. Now there was some natural interconnection, of course, between those bays, and then of course we've dredged the lake over the years, and so there was more interconnection created by the dredging, and of course now in our world of automobiles we've added bridges, so there's a lot of interconnection now, whether you're going by road or by water. So the map of Lake Minnetonka, as you might recognize it today, and the first thing you recognize is the very irregular shoreline, which is such a piece of what Lake Minnetonka looks like to people when you see it. It's fed into Halstead's Bay from 6 Mile Creek. The water flows from Halstead's into the upper lake, and then it flows across to the lower lake, hence the name, right? Upper Lake, Lower Lake. And then it flows from the lower lake into Wayzata Bay, into Grays Bay, and then out to Minnehaha Creek. Then it travels 22 miles down Minnehaha Creek and feeds into the Mississippi River. A couple of statistics about the lake. It's approximately 14,000 acres, approximately 121 to 120 miles of shoreline, and the deepest portion of the lake is in Crystal Bay with a depth, average depth anyways, of about 113 feet. Well, when we talk about the early history of Lake Minnetonka, when we start talking about first time people have seen the lake and that kind of thing, we usually go to 1822 as the first year that, as it's described, non-Native American people saw the lake. And there's two young boys that leave Fort St. Anthony, and Fort St. Anthony today would be known as what? Fort Snelling, excellent. And so they are going to canoe up Minnehaha Creek, and apparently a couple of soldiers from Fort Snelling or Fort St. Anthony also joined them. And so the four of them canoed up Minnehaha Creek, and they got to where that blue arrow is pointing, which is the junction of Minnehaha Creek to Grays Bay. Now the two boys were Joseph Renshaw Brown and William Joseph Snelling. And William Snelling is the son of Josiah Snelling, who eventually becomes the commander of the fort, and hence is what the fort is who the fort is named after eventually. Well, Joseph Brown was apparently friends with the Dakota people and also spoke their language. And so he had heard them talk and refer to this beautiful body of water, and he was very interested in seeing it. So he convinced his friend William, and they canoed to go find it. Once they got to Grays Bay, they were astounded at what they found, this beautiful large body of water that lay ahead of them. And then when they canoed across Grays Bay, they were even more astounded as they got into Wayzata Bay and found more lake. And at first they actually thought it was, they said, a second lake. And we of course would know it all today as just one lake. They stayed 3 or 4 days and camped and fished and supposedly spent one night on Big Island. They went back to the fort and were very excited to share their experience, and nobody at the fort was apparently very interested. They had other things on their mind. Josiah Snelling said to his son, "This is nothing I'm interested in, and I'm never going to travel out and see that lake. I have no interest in it. So we really don't care about it all that much at this point." I'm so thankful that something at least was written down, so we have a little bit of this history that we can share now, many years later. So nothing really much happened for a few years, about 30 years with Lake Minnetonka. A couple more pieces of history though for us to talk about. The first one is what happens before Minnesota becomes a state and before Minnesota becomes a territory. So the picture on the left is showing you kind of the landmass of what Minnesota looked like, and you can see the purple on the right is Wisconsin and the darker blue beneath is Iowa. They became a state in 1846 for Iowa and 1848 for Wisconsin. And so then Minnesota becomes a territory in 1849, and our boundaries basically looked like the picture on the right with the red image against the rest of the United States. And you can see we have some land of both North and South Dakota. Minnesota becomes a state in 1858, and so then our boundaries are going to change again. So this picture is showing us the Mississippi River and outlining its boundaries on the eastern side of each of the states, and I put the X in to kind of show us the location of Lake Minnetonka. And 1851 is a really important year because there's several treaties signed between the American government and the Dakota people. The treaty that has the biggest effect on the Lake Minnetonka area is the treaty signed in August. It's called the Treaty of Mendota. And this treaty was between the Mdewakanton Band and the Wapakute Band of the Dakota people. And the Mdewakanton Band is the band of Dakota that lived in the Lake Minnetonka area. So when this treaty is signed, it opens up millions of acres of land west of the Mississippi River, and is kind of the time when settlement is about to begin. So our first settlement appears in 1852 in what we know today as Minnetonka Mills area, and is followed closely behind in 1853 with Excelsior, followed closely behind that in 1854 with Wayzata, and then we also have some settlers going toward the Upper Lake also in 1854 in what we would know today as the Mound area. So in 1852, the Minnesota Territorial Governor Alexander Ramsey visits Lake Minnetonka. And he visits to the Minnetonka Mills area, and he's talking with Calvin Tuttle and Simon Stevens, who are two of the early settlers in that area. And they take him out to the lake and show him the lake. And he loves it and thinks it's beautiful. And you can see there's a quote I included of what he said. The lake was a perfect inland sea surrounded by the most beautiful timber, and wherever we landed, the soil was of the richest character. And he said to them, "Well, what is the name of this lake?" And it hadn't been officially named at that time. And they said, "Well, a lot of people refer to it as Peninsula Lake because of all the points and fingers of land that project into the bays." And the Dakota people call it Minnetonka, Minnie for water and Tonka for big or large or great. And I'm sure most of you are familiar with that translation of big water or large water. And so he christens the lake and says, well, that's what we're going to call it then, with what the Dakota people called it, is Lake Minnetonka. So one of the questions that I'm posing for us tonight is, what was it like to be an early settler in the Lake Minnetonka area? What was it like to be an early settler to Wayzata? What did they see and feel and experience when they first arrived here? And I thought, well, one way would be to share a couple quotes from a couple of early settlers. So I've highlighted the parts that we're going to look at. The first one is from John Harrington Stevens. And he visited the Minnetonka Mills area again in 1852. This is a letter that he wrote back home to his family and friends. And what he said about Minnesota was, this is a healthy country. We have no bilious fevers. Our climate is delightful, yet our winters are cold but pleasant. The sun shines nearly every day during the whole winter months. And while it's very cold, the atmosphere is so clear and healthy. the persons do not feel the cold half as much as in Missouri. And then, about Lake Minnetonka, he says, now for Minnetonka, maple sugar can be made enough to sweeten a colony of 50,000 souls. The wild game of the country is abundant enough to support any quantity of families. Any family can procure enough fish to last them year-round. The soil is rich and productive. The scenery is far superior to the Hudson Timber Prairie, and oak and maple openings abound all around the lake. Wheat, corn, oats, rye, tomatoes, peas, beans, apples, pears, and peaches grow to perfection. And then he finished his letter by saying, you know, we don't really want to force you to come if you're not interested, but if you're interested, you really should come now because there's not going to be much land left by fall. And then the second quote that I wanted to share with you is from a newspaper man. His name is John Owens, and he actually visits the lake in 1852, and again in 1853, and actually again in 1867. And what he says is the belt of timber is at least 2 miles wide all around the lake, having for its outer margin a heavy growth of very large white oak, with sugar maples being the secondary growth. We have taken the entire circuit of the lake and found as fine timberland as the Great West affords, 100 miles in extent and 2 miles in width, with a navigable lake in the center and the best prairie from its outer boundaries. What an enviable home for the thrifty and affluent agriculturalists. So Owens is referring to the big woods when he talks about the extent of timber 2 miles wide, and that's one of the things that a lot of the early settlers talked about was this immense woods that surrounded the lake, and it was so thick, and they said in some parts that during the day there was very little sun that got through, so it's hard to tell if it was even day or night. Other places there was dappled sun, and but hard to tell where you were because it was just tree after tree after tree, and of course not much had happened yet except a few little paths and trails through the trees. And there's stories with our early settlers of how people got lost and ended up kind of just wandering in circles before they figured out that they were wandering in circles because everything looked the same. The Big Woods was about 100 miles long and about 40 miles wide in its whole extent, with just the, you know, the piece around Lake Minnetonka being the 2 miles on, surrounding the shoreline, and then prairie beyond those trees. Well, a couple of things that the early settlers talked about was how much wild rice grew. So if you think about our lake now and try and picture it with a lot more swamp and a lot more marsh to it. And think about it. We have a street in Wayzata called Rice Street. Why do you think it's called Rice Street? Wild rice was growing, right? So wild rice was very prevalent around the lake, and a lot of this wild rice and cranberry bogs, very prevalent in Grays Bay. And in fact, there's some accounts from some of our residents in the 30s when Lake Minnetonka was at its lowest, around 35, 36, where they talked about the cranberry bogs were starting to surface again in Grays Bay. The other thing that they talked about was the beautiful woodland beauty that surrounded them no matter where they looked or where they went. They talk a lot about 3 specific flowers. You know what flower this is, gardeners in the group? Trillium. Yes, trillium. So they talked about trilliums growing profusely around the borders of the trees, etc., right? We know they love shade. They talked about lilies, both lilies as growing in the soil as well as water lilies. And they talked about the pink and white lady slipper, which eventually becomes their state flower, right? So when our settlers were heading this direction, what is it that they needed to do? Well, first of all, the settlers tended to travel in groups, and they kind of were groups that were formed by commonalities that they shared, such as they were related. Siblings, you know, mother, father, children, cousins, that kind of thing. There was some kind of kinship. Or there was religious commonalities among them. Or there was nationality. Or there was just the commonality of where they came from. A lot of Wayzata's early settlers came from Ohio and Nova Scotia. So they traveled in groups, which was a good thing because it was a long and maybe perilous is a little bit dramatic to use, but it was a challenging journey because they had to take railroad train if there was one available. They had to travel by riverboat. They had to often take a horse and wagon or ox cart and wagon. They had to walk. They took sometimes a few weeks to get here. So it was helpful if they were traveling in groups, kind of safety in numbers, kind of an idea. And then the other thing that we want to think about is once they got here, how did they acquire some land? So in 1841, the Preemption Act was passed. And what this act said was that you are allowed to claim up to 160 acres before this land has been surveyed, measured, and platted by the government. And what you need to do with that 160 acres is you need to put a fence around it, and you need to put a cabin or shanty on it that you're going to live in. And you should plant a garden so you have a way to feed your family. And I read several different accounts, so I don't know if there was different resolutions or whatever, but some accounts said you had to live there at least 90 days, and some said you had to live there at least a year. Now the idea behind this was that they were trying to diminish land speculation because people were coming in, claiming land and never doing anything to it and then hoping to sell it a few years later and make a profit. So they were trying to avoid that, and they were wanting people to, quote, improve the land. So they wanted you to build a small home on it and have a garden and have a family and that kind of thing. This is a section of land, and it's basically just showing that a section is 1 mile square, and if you divided it in fourths, there would be 4 160-acre sections to that section of land. And then the picture in the upper right is showing it divided differently for 80 acres and 40 acres and that kind of thing. I tried to find some pictures of cabins of what early settlers were living in, and the 2 cabins on the right were a little bit earlier. They're in the late 1850s to early 1860s. The Trinum cabin was kind of closer to Long Lake. I was not able to find where the Stafford cabin was located. Both of these pictures came from the Western Hennepin County Pioneer Association. The picture on the left is the cabin built by the Ice family, and that was built here, actually where the Woodhill Country Club stands today. It was built a few years later. As you can see, it's a 2-story cabin. But it's a pretty classic look to the early cabins. You know, they were logged, and they had chinking between the logs to try and give a little protection from weather. And they were usually about 16 by 16 or 16 by 20, so not super big. Well, let's talk about Wayzata. What was happening here? Who first found Wayzata and started to plat it and create a community? The first 2 people to arrive to Wayzata, first one is the gentleman on the left. His name is Oscar Elijah Garrison. And he arrives in about 1853. And he builds a tamarack cabin down on Lake Street, approximately where Joanie's and Talbot's is today. So that's kind of the location of his cabin. And I read something that was kind of cute that talked about the fact that the trees he used to build his cabin were very tall, straight pines, and he was able to cut 30-foot long logs and 20-foot long logs. So guess what size his cabin was? 30 by 20, exactly. The second gentleman to join him was a man named Alfred D. Robinson. And we do not have a picture of Alfred Robinson. And Robinson settled up on the hill that we know as Arlington Heights. And he also built a little cabin, and he didn't stay very long. He stayed about 1.5 years, and then he scooted around the lake a little bit, and he found a little bay. And you know what bay that is, right? Robinson's Bay. Well, then Oscar is joined by Lucius Campbell Walker. And Lucius Walker is actually a post office agent in St. Anthony. And so he's kind of interested to see what Lake Minnetonka and Wayzata is all about. So he comes out this direction. And together he and Oscar really create the Wayzata early community. They do a lot of work to get this village up and running. So the first thing they do is they plat the village. Now this is the plat map of Wayzata. It was filed in May 2nd of 1855. I know you can't read it from where you are, but I just wanted to show you what it looks like, and this is the map that hangs on the wall of our archives if you ever were to visit us down in the archives. And I have a cleaned up version of it that's going to be coming up in a few slides that you'll be able to see better. Well, besides planning the village of Wayzata, the next thing that Oscar does is he hires a man named Amos Gray to build a sawmill. Now you recognize the Gray name, I'm sure, and he of course is who Gray's Bay is going to be named after. So he's going to own land on that bay. And the picture inside the blue circle is the sawmill. And it's located, as you can see, right along the lakeshore. And this little wiggly line is Gleason Creek. I'm going to just point out this is Broadway Avenue. Okay? So this sawmill is sitting approximately where Cross Creek is today, kind of Graham Jewelers and where D'Amico was, at that area if you know downtown Wayzata. And so this sawmill was built in 1855, but it didn't operate for very long. By the toward the end of 1856, the sawmill was put up for sale. It's taken apart, it's going to be moved to where Parker's Lake, and apparently I couldn't find anything that ever said it got put back together and used again. In addition to the sawmill, we've now platted the town, and so what we're going to do is we're going to put those lots up for sale. So Garrison and Walker run an ad in 1855, 300 lots for sale, new city, hurrah for Wayzata. The lots are selling for between $25 and $250, depending on the size of the lot and the location of the lot. And the other thing they do is they start a stage service. And the stage service is going to run 3 times a week, and it's kind of a 2-day cycle. So it leaves Wayzata Monday morning, and it's going to stop in St. Anthony and stop in Minneapolis and get to St. Paul Monday night. And then you stay overnight in St. Paul, and you leave St. Paul Tuesday morning, and you go back through St. Anthony and Minneapolis, and you get back to Wayzata Tuesday night. And then it's going to repeat that same cycle on Wednesday and Thursday, and the same cycle on Friday and Saturday. There's no stage on the Sabbath. And so this was a really important piece because our early settlers didn't have an easy way to get to St. Paul. And there's a lot of accounts where they would walk. And you can imagine that's going to take you a while, and they're having to go to St. Paul to buy something like 100 pounds of flour or sugar. So they're having to carry that back. Or if they're lucky and they have a horse in a wagon or an ox in a wagon. So it was really quite arduous with some of the needs that, to try and meet. So these stage services were quite helpful. This is an early abstract, and I put it in here just for a couple of reasons. First of all, it's hand-drawn. And so it fascinates me because I just love that somebody put the time and the work into this. A woman named Ida Schmitz did this, and apparently Avery Stubbs helped her with some of the information. And what I want you to just notice, because it's not like it's very readable, but just notice the different shapes of the squares. Everybody's land is 160 acres, but notice how different the shapes and squares line up to be. There's a name inside each of them, and there's a year, and then it also says 160A for 160 acres. I circled a couple of them specifically because they're going to be names that you recognize. This is McGinty, so we get a road from there, McGinty Road. This is Amos Gray, so we have Gray's Bay. This is James Shaver, we have Shaver's Lake. This is the section of land that's Robinson, for Robinson's Bay. And I circled these two because we're going to talk about them a little bit later, and these are two brothers, William Harrington and John Stevens Harrington, who each homestead 160 acres in the Ferndale area. So together they're 320 acres in Ferndale. In 1858, the Minnetonka Township is formed. And Lake Minnetonka is spread out between the Minnetonka Township, the Excelsior Township, and the Minnetrista Township. And inside this red square, it's going to get a little bit bigger for you. I wanted to show you Wayzata Bay. Gray's Bay is named Outlet Lake at this point, but it becomes Gray's Bay later. It's all within the Minnetonka Township. So Wayzata wasn't its own township. And it was within Minnetonka Township until 1956. The other thing I wanted to mention is that we're going to look at two early roads that were mapped and platted. The first one here was 1860. And if you look toward the left-hand side here, you can see I've outlined, it's actually orange, but I guess it doesn't show up so well on the slide, it's orange. And that's an early road, 1860, and here's the description of it in the box. The first wagon road laid out in the Minnetonka Township, and it was called Harrington Road. In parentheses, I added, it's now called Ferndale Road. It began at John Stephen Harrington's house, which is going to be right here in Ferndale, near the lakeshore. And it ran in a northeasterly direction. And you see it going up here until it intersects with the Watertown Road about a mile west of the village of Wayzata. Now that's the description as it was written in 1860. And today, I know you can't read it very well. This is a more modern map that I could find the words on it that I wanted. This is Ferndale Road. This is Wayzata Boulevard. So we drive this all the time, those of us that live around here. 1860. Early Wayzata, what was it like? Well, first of all, let's remember that it was surrounded by the big woods, and that in itself provided a huge challenge because it was endless trees that had to be taken down. And it wasn't a lot of mechanization and tools to do it with, right? So it was a challenge to take these trees down. And the good news was, as they took the trees down, they could use the lumber to build their home. They could use the lumber and burn it in the winter for heat. They also, if they had a way to deliver it to a lumber mill, they could also sell it and make some money off of it. So it served them in a few different ways. In 1857, Wayzata actually had 4 buildings. And probably, I'm guessing the population was about 35, 40 people. There were 3 hotels and a small general store. Now the way that I linked this up is, this is kind of a burgundy color, and I put some numbers up here. So the first hotel was here on the corner of Lake Street and Broadway, and it was run by Benjamin Franklin Kiesling. The second hotel was actually here right along Walker Avenue, and it was actually run by William Dudley. His hotel actually burned in 1859, and then he rebuilt a little bit more to the center of the block, and then in 1865 another boarding house was built there named Gleason's Hotel. The third hotel was a block and a half or so west of that, and it was the Days Hotel. And then the number 4 here is the 4th building, and it was a little general store run by Tom Kiesling. And he was here for a couple years until about 1857 or so, and he actually went to Minneapolis. The rest of this map is from a later point in time. You can see that the railroad tracks are here, and they're not exactly right because the railroad doesn't actually follow the lake that way. But the railroad comes in 1867, so the rest of this map is later than 1867. I want to point out here where there's a square and it says saloon. That's a saloon that was run by George Reed. It closed in the late 1870s because there was a temperance movement and the communities went dry. It made it tough for a saloon to stay open at that point. So he closed, and he actually sold to a man named William Bushnell, and it became a general store. Then I also want to point out Depot. This is going to be where our first train station is located. We're going to see pictures of that. And 1857 was a bit of a challenging year. The first thing that happens with our Lake Minnetonka residents, not just Wayzata, but all of Lake Minnetonka, is there's a grasshopper infestation, a grasshopper plague, and they basically eat everything. All the crops, all the trees and leaves, all the fabric, all the linen, everything. So people are devastated, and quite a few people leave at this point in time. I also want to be clear that the picture is not a picture of Lake Minnetonka. It is a picture of the grasshopper plague from 1857, but it's not Lake Minnetonka. I couldn't find one of our area. But you can see how it's just basically devastated. There's nothing left. And in fact, that's the reason the grasshoppers left. It's because there was nothing left for them to eat, so they went somewhere else to find more food. And the plague lasted about 1.5 years or 2 years, depending on the sources that you look at. Well, the second thing that happened in 1857 was kind of a financial panic. And that was very, very challenging also because everybody was suffering financially then. The Ohio Loan and Trust Company, which was a main piece of our banking system at the time, eventually went bankrupt. And so it kind of disrupted the stability of the whole economic system at that point in time. Now the saving grace and the good news was ginseng. Ginseng grew abundantly around Lake Minnetonka. And two brothers from Virginia, last name of Chilton, actually came to Lake Minnetonka, and they hired people to dig ginseng root. And what was so great about this was that they paid them in gold. And they were paid 6 cents a pound. And they said that if you found large, old, rather mature ginseng roots, they could weigh up to half a pound each. And they said that if you were pretty strong and willing to work a pretty decent length of a day, like 10 or 12 hours, you could dig 50 to 60 pounds of ginseng roots a day. So people could make $3 or $4 a day doing this. And that was, according to a lot of our early settlers, and Warren Wakefield being one of them, he said this saved us. Being able to dig the ginseng root and make money out and be paid in gold. This is what really saved a lot of the communities. This is a map from 1860, and the circle in the upper right says Wayzata within it, and the circle in the lower portion, the bottom, says Excelsior within it. And on the left-hand side, you'll see there is no circle in the upper lake area because nothing has been platted there yet. So we don't have any mound city or mound yet on the map. Well, back home here in Wayzata, one of the earliest hotels on the lake to open is going to be the Harrington Hotel. Now we talked about the Dudley and the Day Hotel, but they were not a hotel in the same way that the Harrington House was, because they were basically the home of the Dudleys or the Days, and you would rent a room or a corner or a bed if they had it as you were passing through. So that idea of hotel in 1854 was a little bit different. Now, William Bradford Harrington and his wife Mary arrived first. They actually were in Minnetonka Mills, and they ran the Minnetonka Hotel in Minnetonka Mills. They came to Wayzata in about 1855, and they claimed 160 acres in what is now Ferndale for us. William convinced his brother John to join him. So John came, brought his wife Minerva and their family, and they claimed 160 acres next door to William. John built a home that he named the Lakeside Home. And it didn't take them very long to figure out that they actually were in a pretty good location, and they truly did turn that home into more of what we know today as a hotel. He built an addition on it. He could hold about 14 or 16 guests, and this hotel stood until about 1899, and then it actually did burn. So there's a little map on the left, and in the blue circle is Lookout Point, and Harrington House's little black dot on that point. And then there's also a little ad that talks about the fact that Mr. Harrington is a farmer, and he's going to serve fresh eggs and fresh milk and fresh fruit and fresh vegetables, kind of the original farm to table that we've cycled back to now, right? This is an early photo of Wayzata, probably the earliest photo that we have from the Lake Street area looking out across the bay. And again, I love so many things about it because we see these same familiar things today if we are in the Wayzata area. I've always called this man gazing because he's standing on a hillside, and again, we know how many hills that Wayzata has. And you can see here the lake shore. We do not yet have Lake Street. We do not yet have railroad. As you look across Wayzata Bay, this is Breezy Point. This is going to be a structure we're going to talk about in a minute called Spirit Knob. This is Spirit Island, and this is Ferndale. So there's lots that we can recognize in this early photo. 1867, a rather momentous time for both Wayzata and Lake Minnetonka, because this is the day that the train arrives. Wayzata was very excited to have the train come to town because they knew from the east, where a lot of people came from, where there already was some railroads, that wherever the train was, it brought people, and it really helped communities to grow. And it could bring not just people, but also products and that kind of thing. So the train arrives to Wayzata, and you can see the tracks are along the lakeside there, and it's just two cars. It's an engine and a passenger car. And the passenger car is filled with photojournalists and photographers and journalists from St. Paul and St. Anthony, very interested in seeing Lake Minnetonka and Wayzata. And the tracks only go as far as Wayzata. So when the train gets here, when it's ready to go back toward Minneapolis, it's turned around on a big wooden turntable pulled by horses to point east again and head back toward Minneapolis. The other thing in this picture is a boat. This is the first boat to launch on Lake Minnetonka in 1860. It was owned by Charles Galpin in Excelsior. And when it launched, its name was the Governor Ramsey. By the time it's 1867, when the railroad arrives, the boat has been renamed to Lady of the Lake. Now this boat had a couple of unique pieces to it. First one was it could not go in reverse. So what that meant was a bit of a challenge, right? You couldn't just pull into a dock and back out. So it had to pull along the dock or along the bank parallel to it, and it had a big long 20-foot pole that they would pull out and push against the, right? Push against the shoreline, push itself away, and then turn the point or front of the boat toward the direction they wanted to go. The second thing is that it had all wooden gears, so it broke down quite frequently because the wooden gears would break off. Another early photo of Wayzata, we're dating this to about 1867. This is the railroad, so it's here, might be 1868, but you can see it's still nice and clean, so it hasn't been used a lot yet. And I'm guessing that this is probably about Lake and Broadway, Lake Street and Broadway area. Another early view of Wayzata, and you can see, again, remember things need to have fences and gardens need to be planted. So you can see here that we've got some plantings on the hillside. This picture is a little bit east of where the man that was gazing out was taken from. This is the Minnetonka Hotel, which was built in 1870. And you can see that the railroad is here, and we've got some people down standing along the shoreline. And you can see that the shoreline is a little more organized than it was in the previous picture. Another picture is we're gazing out, and you can see a lot more vegetation is growing. There's also been a little addition added onto that house that we saw earlier. So this picture is going to transition us a little bit, and this is probably about 1880 because we've got some steamboats at the Wayzata waterfront. So the first thing that we're looking at is, you see the blue arrow that I just put in place here. This is a well-worn walking path, and I bet you can tell me what road it's become today. Yes, very good. Broadway Avenue. That's our Broadway Avenue. And you can see here the inclined slope of the hill that we're on tonight. And the second arrow that I put in is going to be a little road that's coming this direction. At this time it's called St. Anthony Road, and we know it today as Mill Street. Right? So if you drove through the community parking lot, if you know Wayzata, and you drove down past the new parking ramp, this is where you would get to. And you would turn, and you would be at Broadway Avenue. You'd either go left, and this would be McCormick's, or if you went straight ahead, this would be the other parking ramp, or you'd take a right and come off the hill. And this is where, like, Grocer's Table is today. So this arrow here in the middle is pointing toward the location of our first train station. And for right now, we're going to call that train station number 1 because it's going to come back and visit us a couple more times. So kind of keep that in mind. Lake Street and Broadway. This is that hotel that was built in 1870 called the Minnetonka House. And the last arrow to show up is pointing at Spirit Knob. So Spirit Knob was an interesting structure. It was a cone-shaped bluff, and it was about 60 feet high, and it was made of dirt and clay and stones and rocks. And the thing that was unique and special about Spirit Knob was that it was very sacred to the Dakota people. So one of the beliefs that they held is that every lake has a spirit or a guardian angel that watches over it. And one of the beliefs that they have is that they want to honor this spirit and keep it happy so that they will keep the waters calm and quiet and peaceful and safe. And the spirit name that they gave for Lake Minnetonka is Umtahi. And this knob or geological land element, whatever you want to call it, was kind of where they felt that the magic and mystery of the lake emanated from, and the power of the lake. Here's a bit of an aerial view coming off of Breezy Point, and you can see kind of the top of the knob is in the very front of the picture. And a little bit more clear picture of it, but I like this one because there's some people. So you get a sense of, you know, a tall, 6 foot or so tall person, and look at the size of that bluff. The other thing that was unique about it was there was a tree that grew out of the top of it, a cedar tree, and it didn't grow straight. It grew up and kind of leaned to the east a little bit. And Spirit Knob stood until probably early 1880s, and it actually ended up kind of being washed away by waves and that kind of thing, and then in the end it was taken down for safety reasons. This is the second road. Remember I mentioned that there'd be 2 early roads that we were going to talk about. This is the second road that I want to mention, and there's only a portion of it on this slide right here, and it's right here. We know this today as Bushaway Road, but this was originally mapped as early as 1858, and on the original map it goes all the way from Dayton, Minnesota, north of us, down to Shakopee, south of us. So this was the trail, right, that the Dakota people would follow. Early Bushaway Road, does it look familiar to you? A little bit, right? Just a little bit. There's not quite the number of trees on it now, and it's a little bit wider, of course, so the cars can drive. The first landowner along Bushaway Road was a man named John Bourgeois, and he was here until about maybe 1855 or so, and people would kind of nickname it kind of Bourgeois Mound. And apparently, as the story goes, is that John left in about 1855. He actually went to Minnetonka Mills and became a blacksmith. And over the course of time, people called this Bourgeois Mound, but the name kind of was changed over the course of time as people couldn't pronounce it very well, and ended up being what we know today as Bushaway. So Bourgeois became Bushaway, and we know this Bushaway Road. Well, if you follow Bushaway Road south far enough, you get to some water. So we have Wayzata Bay in the front and Gray's Bay behind it, and we need something, don't we? We need a way to get across. So the bridge is first built in 1878, and it's actually built by William Cowan, who is over in the Groveland area. And it's got some steel pillars that are going into the water, and then it's got wood planking across the top. Now, I apologize, this is not the greatest quality of a photo, but this is a picture I took with my phone out of a photo album. And this is exactly the quality of the photo in the photo album, but I loved it because it's our early Bushaway Road bridge with a horse and wagon being pulled across it. That bridge, by the way, was condemned in 1898 and taken down, and then the bridge that was rebuilt actually had a swing trestle in the middle to open it up so that boats could get through it. Taller boats, sailboats. This is a drawing of Wayzata Bay looking toward Wayzata that was published in the Lake Minnetonka Tourist in 1876. And you recognize that. Isn't that what just like Wayzata today, right? Here is the cleaned up version of the plat map that we looked at earlier. And what I did in red was I put all the street names. And you recognize almost all of them, don't you? Beaver Dam Street, Gardner Street. On that map it's called Park Lane, and we just call it Park Street. Garrison Street is what we know today as Wayzata Boulevard. Rice Street, Indian Mound, Lake Street. And the streets going north and south, Minnetonka Avenue, Walker Avenue, Broadway Avenue, Chicago Avenue. The next one is slightly different. We know it today as Grand, and on the map here it's actually called Mill Street. We mentioned, I think earlier, the St. Anthony Road when we were looking at that previous picture. And so here is the St. Anthony Road, and that actually is what this map says. It's County Road to St. Anthony. Today we know that as Mill Street. Within this blue square is that sawmill that we saw that Amos Gray built in 1855. And then a couple of other things that I wanted to point out is that in this oval over here, this actually says railroad. So this is one of the tricky things about reading some early maps sometimes, is you have to really be careful because sometimes things don't actually get built, even though they were actually put on a map. So the railroad, they did talk about building it actually north of Lake Street, which we know that it ended up down by our Lake Street. But this map does say railroad right here, and this would be Garrison or Wayzata Boulevard as we know it today. And then again, remember that this is Gleason Creek and it's coming up, and right here along the creek is the word rapids. So that's kind of an interesting thought, right? And then here is also the word mill, and I could find no absolute proof that the mill actually was ever built here. So still looking for that. Not saying it wasn't, but I'm not saying that we have found that yet. So just kind of fun to look at some of those early things that people were speculating to do. And then down here along Lake Street, it says shade trees along shore. It's another thing that it says here. Well, in Wayzata, some of the early things to happen as we're starting to get into the 1870s is the Minnetonka House, which we mentioned already, and it stood until about 1900. It was also called the Mauer House, which is the name of the man that built it first, and eventually it was known as the West Hotel. And its nickname was the Barracks Hotel because it was a long rectangular building that kind of looked like a barracks type building. Picture in the lower right is an ad that was consistently run of it. Then we have the Gleason House, which was actually a little bit more of what they call a boarding house. It looked a little bit more like a house than like a commercial building. And it actually stood right behind the brick building that most recently has had Caribou Coffee in it. You know where that parking ramp entrance is, right behind it? That's where this building stood. And this actually was one of the longer buildings to last into, for Wayzata, lasted until 1964. Well, as we get into the late 1870s, we're moving into a time that in Lake Minnetonka's history is known as the glory years. And the ad on the left here says Healthful Summer Resorts, Minnesota, Lake Minnetonka. And in the upper right, it's talking about come and join us at Lake Minnetonka. We've got resorts and we've got hotels opening for you. And then we have a hotel and boarding house directory that gets printed and lists the hotels and boarding houses open for the season. The first hotel to build in Wayzata during this time, the glory years, is a hotel called the Arlington Hotel. It's the largest hotel to ever stand in Wayzata up until our current hotel, The Landing, was built. This hotel had verandas that ran around the first story and the second story, and that's an important thing that I want to point out because that was a feature of these hotels at the time, because they had balconies and verandas and people would stroll after dinner and they would sit together in chairs, and it was a very community oriented type of thing, as well as I'm sure it was fun to gaze at the lake. And one of the things they talked about was enjoying what they called the cold healthful breezes of Lake Minnetonka. One of the things that was a draw for Lake Minnetonka was people with breathing pathologies would come here to try and feel better and get healthier. So asthma and emphysema and bronchitis and what we would call today COPD and tuberculosis and things like that. The picture on the lower right side here is a drawing of the waterfront along the Arlington Hotel and the Arlington Hotel sitting behind it. And this is actually a photo of the boats lined up along the Wayzata waterfront. And it's hard to see, but this building right back there is the Arlington Hotel. So here's a newspaper that was published in Chicago, New York, and Minneapolis saying beautiful Minnetonka, America's great Northwestern house resort. And this is going to start us now into the glory years when people flocked to Wayzata. And one of the pieces about that was the railroad in Wayzata was very important for that. 18 to 20 trains a day came to Wayzata, filled with thousands of people to visit the lake for the weekend, for the month, for the summer, whatever it might be. This is Wayzata's waterfront in 1881. And what I love about this picture is it's just so classic of the time of how people were living. With transportation, we have the railroad, we have a horse and wagon, we have the boardwalk, and we have steamboats. So just very classic of the time, and there you are, waiting for your boat that's going to take you to Tonka Bay, or Cottagewood, or Deep Haven, or the Upper Lake. Ladies, we're in our long dresses and our long sleeve shirts and our high neck collars and our fancy hats, carrying a parasol in the hot weather. The gentlemen in suits and ties and hats. Here's another group waiting for the large steamer that's going to be coming in. So during this time of the glory years, in 1881 there was about 35,000 people that visited the lake. In 1882 there was 85,000. There was a 50,000 person increase. And in 1883 there was 90,000. So it was really a prolific time for people to be coming to Lake Minnetonka, and they came to the lake on the railroad and got off in Wayzata, as I mentioned, 18 to 20 trains a day. If you can just imagine how busy that waterfront wharf of Wayzata was. We're going to look at a couple of the boats that sailed on the lake at that time. So during the glory years, they say that there was 90 launches on the lake. And here's an example of one of them called the Lotus. It was about 90 feet long and held about 250 people. And here's the Hattie May. It was about 100 feet long and held 350 or 400 people. And notice that in this picture we have the band on the top level of the boat. Also notice how very crowded it is. I couldn't resist putting this picture in here because I'll be very honest and say I tend to very much romanticize this time in our history and think that it would have been so wonderful to, and I really would have loved to have seen these boats and ridden on these boats on the lake. But I laughed when I saw this picture because the actual caption of it was fun on a rainy day. And I thought, oh yeah, you know what? I think it was always perfect and sunny and the sky was always blue. And what happens if I had to take a boat to get somewhere and the only place to sit was on the top deck in this pouring rain? You know, that's definitely going to happen. And it also reminds me too of the difference of the lake then for people than it is for now for us. Because it's fun, it's entertainment, we're swimming, we're water skiing, we're boating, we're fishing, we're canoeing, we're paddleboarding, wakeboarding, whatever. This was main transportation source back then. Not to say people weren't still having some fun on it, but it was really imperative to them of how they got from Wayzata to Excelsior or Cottage Port to Teahaven. So very, very different. Well, we mentioned the first train station in Wayzata, and we mentioned that the train arrived in 1867. We're going to kind of talk about our train history in 3 parts. So this is part number 2. So the piece that we haven't talked about yet involves James J. Hill. So when the train arrived in 1867, it was called the St. Paul and Pacific, and it was not owned by James J. Hill. He did not bring the railroad to Wayzata. He did not have anything to do with where the tracks were laid in Wayzata. Okay? So when the train came, 1867, Wayzata residents are very excited to have it arrive. The train, however, or the railroad, is never really successful. It kind of struggles in all of its years. By 1873, so only 6 years in existence, it's going into receivership. It eventually does go bankrupt, and at that point in time, James J. Hill and a couple of business partners purchase it. So he becomes owner of the railroad in 1879. Okay? They reorganize the business, they rename the railroad to St. Paul, Minneapolis, and Manitoba. And so now we're going to take just a little trip along the North Shore, and I put a couple arrows as we're following that railroad line. And here we're going to be heading over toward Minnetonka Beach. And by the way, on our way to Minnetonka Beach, there was a large section of land that was owned by James J. Hill. He did have a cattle farm along Smith's Bay for a few years, and he raised prize-winning cattle. As we get toward Minnetonka Beach, the end of the land was owned. The end of the land was owned by a man named Holmes, and the water next to that was called Holmes Bay. And this is a picture of, again, this would be where Holmes had settled originally. Here's Holmes Bay, and this is the location of the Hotel Lafayette. So this is the hotel, and you can see how it's lined up with the land. And to the north is Crystal Bay, and to the south is Holmes Bay, which is going to be renamed Lafayette Bay. This is my favorite photo of the Lafayette Hotel because the landscaping is in place and the boardwalks, and I just think it was such a gorgeous hotel to look at. And again, you see this veranda running along the first story, and then we've got balconies and things on the upper stories. This hotel was quite extravagant. It was considered and written about and spoken about as the Grand Dame west of New York City. It started out about 750 feet long, so it was pretty immense. And it was painted olive green with a red roof. I put the picture in the middle so that you could get a sense of the extreme length of it. It was about this long when it first was built, and this was actually an addition put on after its first year in business because it was so busy. They added several more feet, and it ended up being over 800 feet long. The picture on the top is looking toward Crystal Bay, which would be north, and then the picture on the bottom is looking toward Holmes Bay or Lafayette Bay, which would be looking south. And you can see here there's a boat coming into dock, and you can see the covered pavilion for people to wait for the boats, and probably also the railroad train. Well, this is what I call the start of James J. Hill's empire in Lake Minnetonka. So first of all, he now owns the railroad, and as you know, he extends the railroad all the way west to Seattle and earns the nickname the Empire Builder, right? And the railroad eventually becomes the Great Northern, and we still know it today as the Burlington Northern Santa Fe. And behind it is the Lafayette Hotel, which is the largest hotel to ever stand on the lake. And then the third piece of his empire is that he launches the largest boat to ever sail on the lake. And it's called the Belle of Minnetonka. It's about 300 feet long and holds 2,500 people. You can imagine. It had a restaurant. At one point in time, it had about 40 sleeping rooms. It had 2 dance floors. It could have 2 orchestras or bands, and I read that they could play simultaneously and they wouldn't interrupt each other. So, quite immense. The second largest boat to ever sail on the lake is called the City of St. Louis. It actually launched the year before the Belle launched. Now the Belle was 300 feet long and could hold about 2,500 people. The city is about 160 feet long and could hold about 1,500 people. These 2 boats were always in competition with each other, which would not be a surprise, right? And apparently the City of St. Louis could turn more efficiently than the Belle because it was a little smaller, but once the Belle got up to speed, it actually was faster. So I guess there was quite a few races on the lake between these 2 boats. And here's a picture of, again, Lafayette Hotel and the City of St. Louis coming into the dock. And the Lafayette had about 300 rooms, so it was a sizable hotel. Well, as we leave the Lafayette, we're going to go past the Camp Memorial Chapel. You know that today as St. Martin's by the Lake, right? So the Camp Memorial Chapel was built by Major George Camp. He was a lumberman. He actually had a lumber business with T.B. Walker, and it was called Camp and Walker Lumber Company. And actually, it's that business that supplied the lumber to James J. Hill to build the Lafayette Hotel. So George and his wife Lucy had 4 children. And sadly, 3 of those children died in infancy. So they only had 1 child that actually survived into adulthood. So that's why it's originally named the Camp Memorial Chapel. It's a memorial to his 3 deceased children. It's built in 1888, and it's actually built in time for his daughter Lucy to be married in. And I don't know how true this story is, but the story that always goes along with this is that the tower in the house, which by the way the camp house does still stand also, the tower in the house apparently wasn't large enough to accommodate her wedding dress and veil, and allow exactly the presentation apparently that she wanted to have. So she actually was married in the chapel instead. And there's a bit of an interior view of the chapel, and it's kind of a New England kind of style. It's got fine buttresses on the side. It was the architect was Cass Gilbert. But apparently the second reason that the chapel was built was that Camp attended a presentation at Hotel Lafayette that was being given by Bishop Gilbert. And Bishop Gilbert talked to the group about his concern about how wonderful it was that people came to Lake Minnetonka and spent the summer here. But he was very concerned about that long of a vacation from Christianity. and concerned about how long people were going without going to church. And apparently something about that spoke to camp. And so he built this chapel, and he paid to have it built, and then it was the memorial to his children. And a couple of more recent pictures that you might recognize of it. It remained the Camp Memorial Chapel until 1949, and then it was given to the Episcopal Church with the agreement that at least 10 services a year would be held on at least 10 Sundays. And we know it still today is St. Martin's by the Lake. Well, as we're heading back toward Wayzata, we're going to go by Smith's Bay, named for Elliot and Alma Smith. And the plat map right here is the Smith name for the plat map. And then this is a picture of the cabin that they built. And then as we continue on and we go to the next bay, it's Brown's Bay, named for James B. Brown and his wife Ruth. And a little plat map showing their property coming out to Brown's Bay. And today, if you were driving from Wayzata and on Shoreline Drive, you know the house that has the Statue of Liberty and the lions? As you go past it, that's the Brown property. Well, now we're going to finish by coming back to Wayzata, and we're going to look at life in Wayzata and what it was like in the late 1880s up until about 1910. So there's a couple pictures of Wayzata Bay as we're going by. And we're going to start with St. Anthony Road. We've mentioned it a couple of times, and again, it's our Mill Street today, so we're right now driving, we've gone past the Muni, and we'd be coming up against the parking ramp up here, and up at the end of the street, we'd be coming up to Broadway. Well, what was life like in Wayzata during the glory years? Because again, the glory years was a resort time, and it was a tourist attraction time. But what about those of us living in Wayzata? What about residents? We weren't spending our time necessarily always on these launches and going to all of the hotels and things. So I wanted to share a little bit about what Wayzata was doing as a community as it was building itself and increasing in population. And so, first of all, one of the things about Wayzata is that we were quite prolific in building boats. Our first boat builder was Royal Corbin Moore. He started building boats in about 1879, and he had the business until 1912. He sold it in 1912 to Eugene Remaley, and it became Remaley Boat Building Company. And then Remaley merged with Walker Boat Works and Wise Boat Works in 1929, and it became Minnetonka Boat Works. And the building that we know today as the Boat Works building, which is where the Six Smith restaurant is, that's the building that was built in 1929. So the picture here on the bottom shows a new launch that's just been built and it's being delivered on the horse-pulled cart. And a couple pictures of the Moore Boat Works, which sat just west of our Wayzata depot that we know today. And the next thing we're going to think about is building our first brick school. Now, this doesn't mean that there wasn't education happening before 1880, but there wasn't a brick school building, and it was small little cabins that were being used. So in 1880, we built our first brick school. It's 2 stories tall, has 4 rooms, 2 on the first floor and 2 on the second floor. And it's red brick, and it faces Rice Street. So this is going to be up on the corner of Broadway Avenue and Rice Street, where the Winston Townhomes are today, if you're familiar with that. That's the corner we're on right now. Well, in about 1880, we have maybe 85 or 90 students in our school system. And then by 1890, we're going to have about 105 students. But remember, this is only up through 8th grade. That's as far as education is at this point in time. In 1898, we add our first 2 years of high school curriculum. And in 1902, our high school curriculum has become a 4-year curriculum at this point in time. And in 1906, our first graduates graduate from a 4-year high school curriculum. And guess how many of them there were? 3. We're very close. 5 was very close. There was 3. Well, this building is going to be rebuilt because we're outgrowing it by 1910, and we're going to build a bigger building on the same corner in the same location, but this time it's going to face Broadway. And apparently this building was yellow brick. And this building lasts for about 10 years, and then we lose it to fire, and then after that, the next building that's built is the Winston, what becomes known as the Winston School, that a lot of people are familiar with. Well, at the same time, we're going to be building our first permanent church. This is a 30-foot by 30-foot square building made of clapboard, so it's not brick. And as you look at it here, you're going to say, oh, that's kind of an interesting building. That's the front of the building, and I see the windows in the front door. But it gets even more interesting because it actually has a very unique front entryway that's built. It's kind of a corner. So the picture that we have of it shows both of those front doors. And then this is actually a painting that hangs in the Wayzata Community Church today, because Wayzata Congregational Church becomes what we have today as Wayzata Community Church. And so it has a rather unique front entryway. It can hold about 40 people, 45 at the most. It's benches inside for seating. And this front corner you can see here has the chimney for a furnace for heat, and the exact opposite corner has the pulpit for the preacher. And then behind it, what I like about this painting is it's kind of like a little barn area. There was a barn and kind of a little pasture area because, of course, a lot of times people were coming by horse and wagon from the church. And so they had to have a place to put their horses while they were in church. So there was a little barn and pasture behind there. Well, we rebuilt that church in 1911, and so here is the new version of the church. It's a beautiful design by one of our favorite architects, Harry Wild Jones. Oops, I touched the microphone. And what we love about it is that it's got river rock wall and river rock accent around the doorways. Sadly, this church burns in 1916, but it is rebuilt identical to the 1911 church. And here's a picture showing the west side of it with the doorway that's coming out onto Walker Avenue. And then this is kind of a fun picture. This is actually taken from like the front door of the church, so standing over here, looking toward where we are tonight. So this is the hill that we are on tonight. Here's Rice Street. And back here, see this little white triangle? That's the lake. So this is the hillside that we would be visiting today. Well, of course, most churches have a cemetery. Interestingly enough, this actually started before the church started. The first burial in this cemetery was 1855, and it was actually Oscar Garrison's mother, Hannah, that passed away. And this was actually known as Burying Hill. And it becomes an official cemetery and platted with the village in 1882. And of course, it's still there, and we've done 2 or 3 of our cemetery programs have been in that cemetery. Well, as we're getting toward the end of the 1890s, it's time to think about upgrading our fire department equipment. So this picture in 1898 is the testing of their first gasoline-powered fighting equipment. It's made by Waterous. And this gentleman here, if you see this white stripe going vertically up, is holding the hose and he's testing to see if it can go tall enough to save the tallest building in town, which at the time is Bushnell Store. And Bushnell Store today is so after Bushnell, it becomes Lamb Brothers. We're going to look at that. After Lamb Brothers, it becomes Hart's Cafe. You know what's next. After Hart's, it becomes? And after Sunsets, it becomes? Cold. So that's where we are today. That's Cold. Right? They do, by the way, purchase this fire engine, and they're very, very happy with their purchase of it. It's very successful for them. And previous to that, what they owned was 6 red buckets, and a couple of wooden yokes for carrying the buckets, and 3 ladders. So this was quite an upgrade. And this fire rig could be pulled by a horse, or if they didn't have an animal available, they talked about the fact that a couple of the firefighters would pull it themselves. Well, I wanted to do just a little bit of a timeline about kind of some maybe notable things happening to make more of a community out of our Wayzata village. So in 1888, we get our first streetlights. And we have a street lighter, and his name is Thomas Wise. He's paid $20 a year. And every night he lights the street lights. He makes sure they're filled with oil. He makes sure they're clean and operable and doesn't need maintenance on them that needs to be done. In 1897, we're going to start putting in the poles and wires and everything needed for a telephone system. First telephone comes in about 1906. Also in that same year, 1897, we're going to start thinking about extending Lake Street east of Broadway Avenue. And right now, everything east of Broadway Avenue is very swampy and very marsh-like. So it's quite an endeavor to actually lay a road that's going to be going through all of that wetland. We also replaced our boardwalks in town. We're spiffing up the town a little bit, and this picture is actually on the new boardwalk. And it's going to be about 5 years after that we're going to start putting in cement sidewalks. So they come in 1902, and if you happen to have a lot along where the sidewalk was going to be poured, you were assessed 37.5 cents a yard for the cement that's laid, and they said that was half the cost of the sidewalks being laid. And in 1904, we got our first speed limit sign on Lake Street. And guess what the first speed limit was? What was it? Well, you got it surrounded. It was 8. 8 miles an hour was our first speed limit in town. Did you know Wayzata had a band shell? And it's sad, again, this is our Lake and Broadway intersection. This is the Gleason store, which today is McCormick's. This again is Bushnell's, which today is Cove. And here's the band shell, railroad tracks. Here's the band in front of their band shell, Wayzata Cornet Band. And also, do you see the sewer culvert? So we're going to upgrade our sewer system, and we're going to put some culvert from Broadway Avenue underneath the road and the tracks out to Lake Minnetonka. I know. Well, in addition to church and school, another thing that's starting to organize in our village are groups where people can spend time together. And so the Odd Fellows organized in 1889, and they don't build their own building until 1893, so they meet in homes and other places. But the Odd Fellow building was built in 1893, and it just came down a few years ago, and this is where Grocer's Table is located today, is where this building was. Now, in addition to the Odd Fellows, the Masons organized in 1891. They actually don't build their own building until 1922. But between the two groups, we have organizations for men to meet together, and then of course these organizations also have groups for the women. So the International Order of Odd Fellows, which is what IOOF stands for, has the Rebeccas, and then the Masons have the women's group called the Order of the Eastern Star. Wayzata incorporated in 1883, it became a village. And it isn't until 1904 that we built our first village hall. And not everybody in town actually thought we needed a village hall. A lot of people said, you're meeting in the back of Heatherly's General Store. You can keep meeting there. Nothing wrong with that, but they did build a village hall, and it provided a lot for them. It was, of course, the home for the village council and the council chambers. It had a room in the back that served as the jail. It served as a storage place for the fire department equipment. Upstairs was a large open space that they could rent out for community events and that kind of thing. There was also some offices upstairs. And then it also provided the first permanent home for the library and the post office. So as you look at this picture, the arch on the right-hand side is the Wayzata post office, and the arch on the left-hand side is the Wayzata library. Now, the library actually formed in 1895 under the name of Wayzata Library and Literary Club. And Miles Dickey, one of our residents at the time, was very involved in the library and the forming of it. And actually, it was Miles Dickey and Reverend Alice Palmer from the church that put their book collections together to create the first library. And it was located in a small room in the basement of the church. And then when the village hall opened, the library was able to move over here, got a lot more space, and Miles brought over a kitchen table. And this is actually a stove and a stovepipe. Seems a little scary to me next to a shelf of books, but you know, it was a different time. And so anyways, the library was in that location until that building burned in 1955. And then the library came up on the hill where we are tonight, and actually it was probably pretty close to where we're sitting tonight. It was in this extension, and now of course the library, as of 2003, is right on the other side of the parking lot. Well, we also need a hardware store. So our first hardware store comes to town in 1904. It's opened by Roger and Valentine Stubbs, and they owned it for about 5 years, and then you can see there's some other owners throughout the years. But one of the really fun things about this location is that it is a continuous running hardware store for 70 years in the same location. It stood on the block along Lake Street where the 3 brick condos stand today. And that was actually what happened, was that as those condos were being built, everybody along that block had to sell or close. And so that's when Shaver Hardware closed in 1974 for that. So 70 years they were in the same location. Well, we also have to mention a couple of the grocery stores that came to town in 1906. On the east end of town, we have Lamb Brothers. And before it was Lamb Brothers, it was Bushnell, and after it was Lamb Brothers, it was Hart's Cafe. So it's at that Lake and Broadway intersection. And this view of the building is actually looking westward. The Lamb Brothers were Charles and Lauren Lamb. And I put this little ad in the top just so that we could see that they sell groceries and notions and vegetables and fruit and shoes and fabrics, and it's amazing. I mean, it's basically truly a one-stop shop. Everything you need, they have there. And I love this interior view. This calendar actually says it's June 1911, and the organization on the shelves, and you could buy a hat, you could buy shoes. And you actually came in with your list and you gave it to the clerk, and the clerk filled it for you. You did not take the items off the shelf yourself. And then the other service that they offered was that they would go out in the morning by horse and wagon and take orders and deliver them that afternoon. And then once the telephone came to town, you could phone in your order and they would deliver it. And of course, once automobiles came along, it was no longer a horse and wagon that delivered it. On the other end of town, we had another grocery store at the same time, which was Harry Pettit. And this was located at the intersection of Lake and Broadway where Wayzata Blue condominiums are today. And he stood on that corner until 1910, when his building actually was lost to fire. But the other picture that I wanted to put in here is that we had a carriage painter in town by the name of Herbert Blumhauer. And he was located kind of where Sakana is located right now, on Lake Street, kind of Sakana, in that area. And the wagon here, you can't read it from where you're sitting, I don't think, but it says actually H.B. Pettit Groceries on the back of the wagon. Well, after Pettit's building burns and he loses his building, he moves east about a half a block. He builds a new 2-story building. The walls are 18 inches thick cement. And he said, I will never again lose my business to fire. And so it's a stucco building. And notice that it is now going to be Pettit and Kaiser. His brother-in-law joins him in the business. Grocers and bakery, but the bakery was not part of this building. It was a separate building behind it in the parking lot in case of fire, right? Because the bakery is an oven that's going to be running a lot of hours. And then later this becomes Minnetonka Market. Some people might be familiar with it as Minnetonka Market, right? And then next to it is the bank. The bank incorporates in 1908, and it started with a capital investment of $10,000. 5 businessmen each put in $2,000. And one of those businessmen is our boat builder, Royal Corbin Moore, that we talked about earlier. And it's very convenient also because his boat building business is right across the street, and he is also the president of the bank for the first 2 years. So he can just walk across the street, check out the books, and go back to building a boat. So it's really quite convenient. Just a quick little street view early on of Wayzata, somewhere between 1896 and 1900. The Minnetonka House is taken down in 1900, and this is built in 1896. This is where Herbert Boomhauer's carriage painting was located. And you can see we now have 2 sets of tracks. A second set of tracks was added in about 1881 or so, during the glory years, as we had large number of trains coming through town. This is one of my favorite pictures of Ferndale. This is the Ferndale Lake Shore, and I love the beautiful privately owned launches at the docks. And it just, speaks to such a quaint and charming time and in the scenery of our lake. We're going to finish our tour of early 1900s Wayzata by stopping at our, as we call it today, historic Wayzata Depot. It was built in 1906, and it was built by James J. Hill. A couple of things that I'd like to point out in this photo. First, if you follow the cursor, is a building that sits just west of the depot, and it's a 2-story building on the west end and a 1-story building on the east end of it, and this is the Moore Boat Works. We mentioned Royal C. Moore a few minutes earlier in the program as one of our early boat builders here in Wayzata. Secondly, I want to point out the streetcar boat at the dock. That was a fleet of 6 boats that were launched in 1906, the same year that the depot was built. And these streetcar boats were actually designed by the same boat builder, Royal Moore. They were not completely built at this location because they were too large for the building, but they were partially built here. So right along the shoreline that you're seeing, these boats were partially put together. And then the other thing to point out is that in the first years of the existence of the Wayzata Depot, there was not a lot of landscaping that had been done as of yet. Now, this photo should look familiar to you because we saw it a few minutes ago earlier in the program, but I'm coming back to it because we're going to talk a little bit about the overall history of the 3 Wayzata train stations or train depots that have served Wayzata through its 170-year history. In the middle of this picture again is the depot, the rectangular building with the covered pavilion on the west end of it. Now, to keep the story clear, I'm going to refer to this building as Wayzata Depot number 1. So this building was built when the railroad arrived to Wayzata in 1867. But contrary to what some of the stories out there may say, this train station was not built by James J. Hill. The railroad was not owned by James J. Hill. And James J. Hill did not have anything to do with where the tracks were going to be laid for the railroad. This map shows us the depot and pavilion that we just looked at, as well as a few other things. In the circles, I have the left circle, I have indicated the pump house and the water tank. In the second circle to the right of that is the depot and pavilion. In the circle just to the right of that is the scale and the restroom, which on this map is labeled as a privy. And so you can see that there's a few different structures and buildings above and beyond the depot that were lined up along the lakeshore. Now, this is one of the things that the Wayzata residents complained about. In 1883, Wayzata incorporated as a village. And after that happened, the residents of Wayzata started to complain about the railroad. They were very excited when it first arrived in Wayzata in 1867, but within a few years, they were less excited. It was noisy, it was dirty, it was smelly, and it had lots of other structures that blocked their view of the lake. In addition, there also were some spur tracks or side tracks that had been installed, and it was on those tracks that empty or isolated railroad cars would sit, apparently sometimes for up to a couple of weeks of time. And all of this together was concerning to the residents because it blocked their view of the lake. The other thing that you can see in this map is there's some docks associated with the railroad. Here on the left, we have the steamship dock. The next dock over is the boat dock. And then To the very right and inside the blue circle is the coal dock. So remember, these are steam locomotives. They're having coal dumped in order for them to use that along with the water coming up through the tank, of course, to create the steam for the steam engines. So there was a lot happening here along the waterfront in addition to just the depot. Well, as I mentioned, the residents of Wayzata were not very happy with all of the enterprise, shall we say, that ended up being part of the railroad. And for about 10 years, it appears that there were lawsuits and kind of discussions / arguments that went back and forth between the village of Wayzata and the railroad itself. The bottom of this slide has a paragraph out of a letter that was actually sent from the Great Northern Railroad. The top part of the slide is the same wording of that letter, but I wanted to highlight a few things. So what happens toward the end of that 10-year time in about 1890 is that the village of Wayzata has sued the railroad, and they're wanting the railroad to move its tracks as well as remove all of the other things we just looked at that have to do with the railroad business. This lawsuit went as far as the Supreme Court of Minnesota. The Supreme Court ruling came back that the railroad does not need to move or remove the tracks. So that's what this line here is saying. The Supreme Court of Minnesota refused to compel the removal of the main tracks. So the railroad does not have to move its tracks. However, the Supreme Court did order that the railroad does need to remove all of the side tracks or spur tracks. It needs to remove the railroad station, and it needs to remove any other facilities related to the business of the railroad. So the water tank, the pump house, the privy, all of those other things we looked at. And so that's what the railroad did. And that's what this last line is saying. And we, that's the railroad, accordingly moved the depot, the wharves, and the steamboat landing to a point outside the village. What does that mean? It means that railroad depot or railroad station number 1 has been removed per order of the Supreme Court. Railroad depot number 2 is about to be built. Unfortunately, we do not have an actual photo as of yet of this train depot, but we do have a copy of the architect drawing. So here I've tried to include the entire length of the depot number 2 so that you can get a sense of what it looked like. And this is looking from north to south. So it's like you're standing on the railroad tracks looking at the north side of the depot. At the top, I put what it says on the plan, which is Great Northern Railway, Depot at Wayzata, 1893. So that gives you a bit of a timing or sense of timing of when this depot was built. And then at the bottom, I've labeled with some arrows so we can see what the different parts of it are like. The left-hand side of the picture is a covered waiting pavilion, and this would be the east side of the building. The next arrow says baggage claim, so that end of the depot is where the baggage claim was. The next arrow is actually pointing at a bay window in the center section of the building, which was the station master's office. And then the right arrow is the right side waiting platform. Now I took that same plan and cropped it so that we could look at the actual depot itself a little bit larger size. Again, you can see the baggage claim is on the left and the rest of the depot is on the right. The office is this section with the bay window, but notice that there's 2 doors, one on either side of that bay window. This depot apparently actually had 2 waiting rooms, one for men and one for women. And so they waited in separate sections apparently of this depot. And we do not know which side was the men's side or which side was the women's side. The other question that I had about this depot, because we don't have an actual photograph of it, is that in a memoir written by one of our early residents, he has a couple of statements about this depot, and one of them is that he said it was a beautiful depot and that it was painted red with white trim. So I talked to the Great Northern Railroad Historical Society about depot colors, and they shared with me kind of a color sample of the colors, and I took the red off of that sample and I left the top piece of it here. So you can see that this is the colors used by the Great Northern Railway, 1890 to 1960. And remember, this is 1893, and they label the color as mineral red. And so it makes sense that this depot was probably somewhat close to that color palette of mineral red, again, with white trim. Now, we're not exactly sure how long this second depot actually stood. We know that it was damaged by a tornado in 1904, and we are unclear as to what year the depot actually was removed. But what we do know that happened next on that location is that another pavilion was built. You can see it's not as extensive as a depot. It's just a waiting pavilion. And this was built in 1911. Now, here's the really interesting thing about the name. By 1911, our current depot, which was built in 1906, is standing and is in use. And you can't have two stops on the railroad line with the same name, because that would be very confusing. So the current depot was labeled as the Wayzata Depot, and so this second depot, which previously had been known as the Wayzata Depot, had to take on a new name once this new platform was built. So this is known as the Holdridge Pavilion. And apparently Holdridge was the maiden name of a good friend of James J. Hill's wife. Her name was Florence Holdridge Babcock. So the Holdridge piece is apparently how the name was given to this pavilion. And as we know today, if you're familiar with Wayzata, we have a neighborhood just north of where this pavilion stood that's called the Holdridge neighborhood. So that name has stuck. Now, this pavilion was in existence until 1928. And you can see I included here a little piece from an AFE that talked about in October of 1928, the cost to remove this pavilion and the platform around it was going to be $50. And apparently that pavilion was removed and was actually purchased by somebody for personal use, and they paid $25 for it. So the next question that I had and was trying to do some research on was, for how many years did Wayzata have two stops, one at Holdridge and one at our current depot along Lake Street of Wayzata? So in going back and looking through our Great Northern Railway schedules, I put one in here, which is from 1914, and you can see by the blue arrow that it says Holdridge as a stop and Wayzata as a stop. And then, of course, opposite order, because east and west, Wayzata and Holdridge. And we have schedules that went up through 1926, and Holdridge and Wayzata were both listed as stops through at least 1926, and we know that that pavilion stood until 1928. So kind of guessing that it might have been used as a stop until it was removed in October of 1928. And that brings us back to our current depot of today, which I would, I guess, essentially be calling Wayzata Depot number 3. This is one of my favorite photos because I love the horse and carriage that's sitting under the front portiere, which is on the south side of the depot, and the lake would be over here further to the right. And then the other comment to make in looking at this picture would be about the style of this depot. Apparently, this was a very unique depot in the fact that it's a Tudor look kind of architectural style. And most of the depots being built at this time were long rectangular buildings, like what we saw for our depot number 1. And they were fairly simple in design. And this was a fairly significant design written about in a lot of the early things and described as being the, quote, handsomest depot along the Great Northern Line. And again, in asking the question to the Great Northern Railroad Historical Society, if there were other depots that were built along the line to look like this, their answer is no. To their knowledge, this is the only one. So it kind of makes our Wayzata Depot very unique for many ways. And then the other thing I want to point out is if we come over here toward the left side of the depot, first of all, this is the baggage claim area, and this would be the home of the Wayzata Chamber of Commerce at this point in time. And the east side of the depot is the museum for the Lake Minnetonka Historical Society. But if we come to this pillar here, you'll see there's a cement structure sitting on the ground next to it. And that is apparently actually a tombstone that has been delivered by the railroad, and it is sitting there waiting for whoever's going to pick it up and have it delivered to the cemetery. I love this early photo of the depot from the lake because it's just such a different view than what we have today with all of the shrubbery and things along the lakeshore. And another one of my other favorite photos is looking from a little bit further out of Wayzata Bay toward the depot. And it just gives you a sense of the shoreline. Here is the depot dock. You can see a large number of the trees. And it's just such a beautiful kind of shoreline view. This is about 1910 to 1912. And so I'd like to finish with a couple of last thoughts. And the first one for me is what the lake means to us now versus what the lake meant to our early settlers. Today, I think we would all say that we love the lake and we enjoy the fun that it brings to us. And we're able to go fishing and canoeing and kayaking and skiing and boating and jet skiing and windsurfing and tubing and swimming. And our early settlers could do also some of those things. And here we are looking at a family and some children enjoying some time in the lake, cooling down. They're wearing their very fashionable swimwear of the turn of the century, and the kids are playing in the water, and the ladies are standing ankle deep, so to speak, and cooling off with the heat of the summer. And then also we want to remember that our lake has always been about sailing. And the Minnetonka Yacht Club incorporated in 1882. So here's a couple of early sailing pictures, the top one being a regatta in the upper left, and recognizing that we still have regattas happening today. And our Minnetonka Yacht Club is still very popular. And we also have the Wayzata Yacht Club, which began in about 1964. So sailing has always been a piece of our lake history. And my final slide, I'm choosing this slide similar to how I started the program. I started the program with a quote written about Lake Minnetonka in 1884. And I chose that quote because even though it was describing the lake 140 years ago, so much of it would be familiar to us today. And I chose this picture for the same reason. This picture is 1895. And so much of it is recognizable to what Wayzata looks like for us today. So we certainly recognize the tracks along the shoreline. We recognize the curve in the shoreline. This piece of land, which of course now has got many more homes on it, nonetheless, it still exists. And the building at the end of the tracks here would be Bushnell General Store at the time of this photo and would be the location of Cove Restaurant today. And here we would have where Lake Street is going, and on the north side of Lake Street through Wayzata's history has been homes, has been businesses, and currently it's businesses, but of a slightly different type, mostly restaurants and condos. The second set of tracks is clearly visible in this photo, which were installed in about 1882 and were removed in the early 1980s. But my most favorite part of the picture is these two darling little children who are about to cross the tracks. And the boy is carrying a kind of a cane fishing pole. And here they are going to cross the tracks, and they're going to come over to the lakeshore, and they're going to spend a little time probably fishing for sunnies and crappies, maybe skipping some stones across the nice smooth water. But so, again, so much of this is so familiar to us. And it just always reminds me of how history is really so much about change, and how we as the Historical Society want to honor history then, we want to honor history now, we want to recognize the change that comes with it, but yet the history itself will always remain. So I thank you so much for joining us tonight for our program. I hope you've enjoyed some of the early Wayzata history, some of the early Lake Minnetonka history. and a few of the resources that I used for sources of information as well as photos for this program. And then, as always, a huge thank you to send out to my colleagues, our volunteer Molly Lucas, and my Lake Minnetonka Historical Society fellow board members, Jeff Magnuson, Scott McGinnis, Sue Sorrentino, and Lisa Stevens.
I ask you to join as a member. That will help you stay in the loop when we do programs such as this. All of our programs, the first 3 programs we've done, have sold out. So we're completely full. It's kind of unbelievable. And I was talking to a number of people in the lobby. You know, we're going to probably be looking at some larger venues, looking at doing these twice. They will be recorded. They will be on our website and on YouTube. So if you have friends who couldn't make it, they may be able to make it in person. They may be able to watch it on YouTube. You can sign up to volunteer. We have museums in West Tonka Mound, which is open year-round, Wayzata Depot, and Excelsior, which are closed right now, will be opening in the spring. We have a special need for museum hosts at the Wayzata Depot Museum. So if you love history, you love people, you like the lake, you want to hang out, go to our website or sign up on the list there, and we will contact you and train you. The shifts can be short. You can take as many or as few as you want over the year. It's a lot of fun, and that museum's open for 6 months, I think, out of the year. But we can't be open without you. So if you don't want to do it, and you know someone else who might like to do it, please send them to us, because we'll be training pretty soon on that. Other museums also need hosts as well. So if any of those cities appeal to you, we have some people who volunteer at all 3. And it is a lot of fun. You'll get a good feeling for the entire history of the entire lake, the early history, which we tend not to do. We have a special map of Wayzata that happens to be made by Scott McGinnis, but it is from what year, Scott?
This is 1898. It's a digitally restored map from Hennepin County Atlas by Peter M. Gall. This took about 200 hours to digitally restore. They're printed on archival paper with archival ink. They're framed, ready to go out the door for $175.
And he will take orders. They're made to order. He sometimes delivers, otherwise you pick them up from us. All of our merchandise, I should mention this, is in that corner. So lots of books about Wayzata. This is your chance to see them. Some of them will sell out. They're going to become rare books pretty soon. We're selling some of the last of our stuff.